Hey there, folks. This is Blake with the Oregon Department of Energy. Thanks for joining. Looks like folks are logging on right now, so we'll give everybody a couple more minutes to do that. Hope everybody is having a good week and had maybe a long holiday weekend. Had a good long holiday weekend. Hey there, everyone. This is Blake Schlide with the Oregon Department of Energy. We'll just give maybe one more minute for people to log on. Looks like we're reaching a pretty good attendance here, though. So. Okay, it's 1:03, so I think we can go ahead and get started. Just a reminder that we are recording this session. My name is Blake Schlide. I'm the manager of the Codes and Standards section at the Oregon Department of Energy. And this is the September 4th meeting of the Building Performance Standards Rulemaking Advisory Committee. We've got an agenda today that really just includes a couple items. The first one, we wanted to give an overview, kind of a summary of the RAC activity to date as we've gone through each of the chapters of Standard 100 and the appendices, to review some of the comments that we've received, summarize those, and then also provide a level of a response back to those comments and how we've made, in some cases, changes and edits to the rules to incorporate those. And then I also wanted to bring up a recently published revision to the Washington Clean Building Standard and Washington's version of Standard 100 that was published, made available in August, based on rules that were filed, I think, at the end of July for Washington. There's a few elements of that revision up in Washington that I wanted to discuss for RAC feedback for if and how we incorporate those into Oregon, as we're still in our development process and have the ability to roll some of those additions in now. So there's a few elements of that change that we wanted to go over, mostly around a new pathway for district energy systems, and then a couple other changes for definitions, for example, for their like qualified energy auditor definitions too. So we'll take a look at those changes. Looking forward to some discussion, and definitely want to hear any feedback that RAC members have on that. And then we'll just briefly talk about the next step. So this is the final RAC meeting of the series that we have scheduled. If there's a need to schedule another one while we have the public comment period open or something else, I think we're open to that. But this is the final scheduled RAC meeting before we finalize our draft rules by the end of the month, and publish those for public comment. So they'll be open for public comment. The plan is to have them open during the month of October, and then hold a public hearing in November. So they'll be open during October and then up until that public hearing too for public comment. So that's just where we are with the overall process. But do any RAC members have any suggested changes or edits or additions to the agenda for today? Okay. Well, I guess not hearing any comments there, then I think we can go ahead and get going with kind of a review of some of the comments that we've gotten. So the way I was going to approach this was just to kind of work through. So I went back through a lot of the comments that we've received either through the comment portal or just verbally in our RAC meetings, going back and looking at our notes and the transcriptions, and just tried my best to summarize what some of those comments were, how we've incorporated them into the rules if we have, and then what the responses are. So I'll just kind of go through each one of these, and then RAC members, if there's any need for any like additional discussion or clarification as we do that, definitely happy to stop along the way and do that. So let's see, going back to like when we were looking at chapter 3 and the definitions, there was some discussion of the greenhouse gas emissions factors, and there was a recommendation from the RAC to clarify that the emissions factors, particularly for the electricity scope 2 emissions factors, should use utility-specific greenhouse gas emissions conversion factors from the DEQ, just in the event that there is like a statewide factor that's published or a region-wide emissions factor that the portfolio manager and some of the other references use, like the EGRIT factors, because initially we had just a reference there to you should use DEQ factors. So we did add a clarification in the draft rules, and let me see if I can make this all on one screen here. We've added that there's been some clarification added that they should use utility-specific factors, and then the most recent year available as well. There is typically a year or two lag with when those are published, but they should use the, like when calculating emissions, it should use the applicable year for that energy use or the most recent year that's available for that. So we made that clarification in the rules. There was some discussion around the need to define site, like what is a building site, what is on-site energy production. So we've referenced, there's a different ASHRAE standard, ASHRAE standard 228, that has a pretty good definition of site. And I think what I'll actually do is just pull up maybe our draft rules here so we can kind of reference where the changes that we've made are. This is the draft rules, and this was the addition that we made for the first item. So in a, oh, actually, no, it's over here for building greenhouse gas emissions. So emissions related to electricity shall be calculated using utility-specific emissions factors for the corresponding year. And when emissions factors for the corresponding year are not available, the most recent year available shall be used. So that was how we addressed that first comment. The second one was around a need for a definition of building site. So we've referenced a definition for site. That means a building, portion of a building, or a group of buildings and surrounding area of land inside the boundary that is contiguous or separated only by public rights of way, all of which are under the same ownership or control. So this, I think where this probably comes most into play is with regard to on-site energy production and the net energy use. So if you've got some on-site energy production, it can be essentially subtracted out from the overall building use for meeting the EUI targets within the definition of that net energy consumption. So there was some concern that, if we don't have a definition of site, then somebody could potentially include off-site energy production and use that to meet their net energy goals. But so we've included this definition of site in there. There was a comment about the savings to investment ratio, and that that pathway seems like it could potentially be a flexible way to avoid compliance. And there was a general comment to align with Washington State, make sure that we use the same administrative rule language, and to consult with Commerce about how they're enforcing that accurate application of the savings to investment ratio. And this is around the idea of if somebody's following the investment criteria pathway and doing an energy audit, that there's the potential for potentially inflating the cost and deflating the savings, and showing that there's no measures, optimized bundle of measures that would pay back for themselves. So we did have some consultation with Washington. We've used identical language to Washington. it was essentially flagged and identified as an issue that could take place there as well. There's not necessarily a simple way to address it. It's all part of this investment criteria pathway, and we'll get to it later when we address some of the comments around audits. But we have built into the rules the ability that ODO, as the authority having jurisdiction, retains the ability to essentially audit the audits, and that we could potentially disqualify an energy auditor if there's repeated documentation and repeated situations where there are inaccurate energy audits performed. So we did want to kind of retain that ability. So we've built some of that language into the rules too. There was some discussion early on around compliance penalties and definitions around that. All the language around the civil penalties and how those are enforced and the process around that, and the ability for, if somebody is assessed a penalty, to appeal, all of that is included in the Tier 1 Buildings Reporting Requirements Appendix. That comment came up early on when we were still working through definitions, and that's since been addressed after we've worked through the that Tier 1 Buildings Reporting Requirements Appendix. There was a comment around weather normalization, and should we consider adding a definition for future weather or future climate protections that could be used to adjust the weather normalized calculations over time? We definitely understand this comment and see the value in looking toward future weather conditions, given that they're changing. But one of the challenges there is that the weather normalizations performed using Energy Star Portfolio Manager calculations. That's not something that we do as an agency. So an owner would report their energy usage, and the weather normalizations all done within the Portfolio Manager software and platform. I know that EPA does periodically update the weather data that they use for this, but it is a historical view. But unfortunately, because Energy Star Portfolio Manager is used for this function, we don't necessarily have the flexibility to look toward a future weather scenario. It's all embedded within the reporting software. But it's something that we'll continue to consider, and maybe there's an opportunity to work with EPA and looking at some of these things. But that would be something that we'd have to look to in the future. There was a comment around, let's see, I just want to make sure I'm not missing any questions or hands raised. And Wendy, if you do see any hands raised or questions coming through the chat, please let me know. Oh, I do see one. Here we go. Yeah, is the summary document with summary comments shared with us? It is. It's up on the SharePoint site now. So if anybody wants to go back and look for it, it's in just the folder, the general folder for the highest level of the rack. So yeah, if you look on the SharePoint site, it's not in today's meeting, but it's just in the general rack folder. So
like the ASHRAE standards with all the edits were in the SharePoint folder, unless that was updated today. I looked yesterday and it didn't seem to have the comments.
They are, but they'll be under each individual meeting that we reviewed them.
Oh, gotcha. Okay.
Yep.
Thanks.
Yeah. And then so right now we're kind of working through incorporating a lot of these comments, and then just making sure that all of the the chapters 1 through 9 and then the appendices are all kind of matching and meshing as we look toward publishing that public draft comment version by the end of the month. So we'll be kind of incorporating all of the sections together and then publishing that one draft for review by the end of the month too. And that'll be available up on our website at the time also. So we've got just some general cleanup to do, I think. But if you do want to go back and reference the changes that we've reviewed as a rack, those are in the individual meeting folders as well. So, and then let's see, I think we're on line 8. So whole building energy use, there was a comment around, should we consider adding a definition for whole building energy analysis so that bundles of EEMs and ERMs can be considered for compliance with the Act? And there was a reference to a similar Oregon Public Utility Commission order. where they granted the Energy Trust the ability to allow whole building cost effectiveness analysis. And for the purposes of the building performance standard, whole building analysis, whole building energy measures are certainly allowed and encouraged. I don't know that we need to add any specific like ability or approval or eligibility for whole building measures could be just because of the structure of the building performance standard being based on whole building EUI, where a whole building measure or a combination of measures could certainly be used to meet the energy targets. So I don't think that there's any need for adding some sort of definition for whole building energy analysis. The same way that there might be with utility programs that have traditionally looked at like individual measures and cost effectiveness. So we haven't made any changes here. If there are any additional concerns or like limitations that folks see here, definitely wanting to hear that. But bundles of measures can certainly be considered to help a building owner achieve compliance. We've got the definitions for what an optimized bundle of measures needs to be incorporated if they're following the investment criteria pathway. And when somebody's doing energy audit, we would expect that if it's a level 2 energy audit, it's including a comprehensive look at whole building energy measures and the overall building energy savings that are achievable with those measures. So we haven't added any definition for that whole building energy analysis in there, just because I don't think it's necessary. But if anyone feels strongly, please let us know. There was a general comment about the importance and the need for complementary utility programs to aid building owners in reaching compliance. And we definitely agree with this. It's something that we're going to continue to work with utilities, across the state and NEA. We've had some initial conversations on how we can develop programs that support and accelerate building owners with achieving compliance. So not necessarily something that's part of the rules, but it is definitely something that will be part of program implementation. There was a comment about the conditional compliance and discussing conditional compliance and a process for instances of indefinite conditional compliance. So the conditional compliance pathways and all the required documentation, including the continued reporting and follow-up reports, is part of that Tier 1 building reporting requirements appendix, where it's got the requirements for annual follow-ups and reporting if a building owner and a building are granted conditional compliance toward ultimately getting under full compliance. So there's not just an opportunity for just indefinite conditional compliance. So let's see. So on-site, there's another comment that came in later about on-site energy and how the site isn't really well defined. This is similar to the other comment that we reviewed up above. So like site isn't really well defined within the ASHRAE standard 100 itself for generation of wind or solar on site. So how far from the main building can it be? So we did add that general definition of site from ASHRAE standard 228 to address this comment as well. So that one's related to the other one that we discussed just a few minutes ago. When we were discussing the energy related to electric vehicle charging, there was a question about, is electricity for EV charging considered exported, and how can sites account for EV charging without requiring separate meters? So in the bill itself, it does allow for the exclusion of energy used for transportation. So the electricity used for charging EVs does not contribute to a building site energy use and the EUI for the purposes of meeting the BPS. So there is language that allows for some estimation of that if it's through a methodology that's acceptable to ODO. So this will be part of implementation. So ideally, somebody's got that measured and metered where they can just subtract it out. But if there is a need to estimate it, then that will be allowed. We recognize that not in every case there's not the ability to meter that, even though ideally it could be. So that'll be part of our program implementation. If a building owner does need to estimate that, how they do that. So it looks like there's some questions in there about, let's see, RAC SharePoint site access. Go back and find the link. It works. I'm happy to resend the link after the meeting too. Sorry if folks aren't getting access. I'm not sure why the access would go away, but if somebody does have a link to it and can put it in the chat, it looks like Clark's doing that. That might be helpful. So thanks a lot. There was a comment when we were talking about gross floor area and looking at the definitions from the bill and some of the sub definitions for what's included and what's not included, and making sure that those align with portfolio manager. So we have taken the definitions from 3409 and then clarified them based on some of the specifics in portfolio manager, just to make sure that they are in alignment. So we think that they are in alignment, and there's no conflicts there, but I'll pull those up too, just to show. Okay, so here's the definition for gross floor area, and then this clarification here about what it does not include. The language here has parts of what was in 3409, but also expanded to better align with what's in portfolio manager for the definition. So we definitely agree that there's got to be alignment between our rules and what's in portfolio manager, because that will be what's used for documentation. So we've done our best to match those up here and make sure that there's no conflicts. For personnel certifications, particularly around the qualified energy auditor and qualified person, there are these required certifications to be able to perform these roles for BPS program compliance. And we've essentially matched what's in Washington State for those. So for the qualified energy auditor in particular, there were some recent updates to Washington that we'll talk about when we get to the Washington updates portion of the meeting today, but it essentially added a couple certifications to what it means to be a qualified energy auditor. Right now we have the ASHRAE Building Energy Assessment Professional Certification and the AEE Certified Energy Auditor in there, in addition to being a professionally licensed architect or engineer, as what it would require to be a certified energy auditor or qualified energy auditor. So those will remain, but we'll likely look to adding a couple others to match with Washington as well. We did get another comment too about considering the definition of qualified energy auditor. Right now, it includes only for professional licensure, a licensed engineer or architect in Oregon rather. And there was a comment around the ability to include a PE that's qualified in any state. And we've not made a change there, mostly because it's relatively simple it's relatively easy for a licensed engineer in another state to achieve or obtain a license in Oregon. Just about every state that I'm aware of has reciprocity or comity by application. And somebody who's licensed in another state, this is pretty common in large firms for engineers to be licensed in multiple states that they're doing business, and it's not particularly cumbersome or expensive to do that. So we feel that if a firm is going to be doing work in Oregon, that they should be licensed to do that work in Oregon. And I would also have some concerns around the even like delegation of authority to like another state's professional engineering licensure board. And I would have some questions about our ability to even do that. So we would still require a licensure in Oregon for if somebody is following the PE or licensed architect pathway to be a qualified energy auditor. So let's see, there was a comment around, there's the definition of baseline in the standard 100, and it talks about like the beginning of compliance, the baseline at the beginning of the compliance determination process, and adding more clarity on what that means. So I went back and looked, and the term baseline isn't actually used much in the 2024 version of the standard 100. I think it was used more often in the previous versions where it may be applied in more situations. But in the 2024 version, which we're basing our BPS on, it's really only used in one place, and that's in the residential dwelling units chapter, which we're not adopting. So I think it's not really applicable here, so it can even be deleted. So there was some confusion around like what that means within the definition and some of the language within the definition. So we've just gone ahead and removed it because it's really not used. So. Let's see, I do see a comment around, please consider making the auditor have 3 years of experience with commercial audits. That is, I believe, and maybe someone else can confirm, one of the recent additions to the Washington requirements, and we would look to roll in the same. So, and Vin has a comment about EPA's new guidance for including or excluding EV charging in the site EUI. So thanks for that. We'll look at that too. We did have some discussion around a different target for more recently built buildings and whether or not that was something to be incorporated into the Oregon EUI targets. This is something that's part of the Washington standard, but as we've discussed, and if you remember, the way that Washington sets their targets is a little bit different than the way that Oregon is setting our targets, where our most efficient targets can be the average energy use. So we would only be able to set a more efficient target for new construction if the target for other buildings is somewhat less efficient than the average energy use. So the general guidance that we've received from the RAC was to create targets that are based on that average energy use in kind of in alignment with the overall guiding principle of the bill to seek to maximize greenhouse gas reduction. So given that, the most efficient targets that we can set are at the average. We are going to have common targets between newly constructed buildings and existing buildings. We expect that newly constructed buildings should not have an issue with meeting the targets. You know, I would imagine that any building built to like a new energy code and a more efficient energy code should meet an average building energy use target. We understand there might be some cases where they don't, and there might be a need to follow the investment criteria pathway. But that's just a consideration. So the general guidance that we received and feedback from the RAC was that we do not need to include a separate pathway that requires stricter targets for more recently built buildings. There was a comment around commissioning and how every building is a unique product that needs to be checked, commissioned as an effective strategy and efficiency measure. We definitely agree. I don't know that this was something that we needed to, direction to change any rule language, but we definitely agree. I think in a lot of cases, particularly complying with this first round of energy targets, many buildings will probably be able to meet the target if they don't already, through taking a little finer look at the way that their buildings operated, maybe through retro commissioning and similar measures. So we definitely agree with the importance of commissioning and retro commissioning. Okay, next item. So there was a comment around required versus optimized bundles of EEMs, and there doesn't really seem to be consistency on what the EEMs, whether they're required versus recommended. And there's this section 4.4.2.3 that talks about an optimized bundle rather than required EEMs. So I went back and looked at this section. This section covers buildings that's with a performance target that don't meet that target. So in these cases, the buildings are required to perform an audit and implement the measures to achieve the performance targets, but they wouldn't necessarily have to implement a full optimized bundle of measures if not all the measures are required to meet that EUI. So we did modify the language just to clarify that in those cases, let's see. So upon completion of implementation, so for buildings that don't meet the targets, they do an audit, and then upon completion of the implementation of all the required EEMs to meet the EUI target. So that's what a required EEM means. If you've got to do an audit and identify measures to get down to meeting the target, and then if a building owner completes those measures, the building can be granted conditional compliance after completion of those measures. So if you identify that there's 3 measures that need to be done, and based on the energy projection savings, that after completion of those measures, a building will meet the EUI target after those measures are implemented, but before a building has a chance to kind of prove out its ability to meet that EUI target, it can receive conditional compliance in that case. So we've added some clarifications there. There was a comment around conditional compliance and need for coordinating conditional compliance in the investment criteria with Washington. We've really used the Washington investment criteria and Tier 1 building reporting requirements as our baseline and as our model. So we think that there's really close coordination there. There was a question around the investment criteria, and if a building doesn't have an EUI target, how do you set or how do you meet the energy and emissions savings goals? In cases where a building doesn't have an EUI target, they would need to follow that investment criteria pathway of doing an energy audit and implementing the optimized bundle of measures. When we were discussing Chapter 5, there was a lot of discussion around the energy and emissions management plan, and should we include the emissions components of that plan as well, even if emissions aren't a direct performance component of Oregon's building performance standard? Is there still value to the building owner? So the general consensus and feedback that we got from the RAC was that yes, this component of the management plan should remain, the emissions portion, because it aligns with the overall goals and the guiding principles of the building performance standard. But we've removed all the references to specific greenhouse gas intensity targets because those aren't required as part of BPS compliance. So those have been removed for clarity. There was a comment around for the investment criteria, who determines the savings to investment ratio? And is there a need for a tight definition of that ratio, or can it become an easy out for compliance? So that's a role of the qualified energy auditor to make that determination, to do an audit, to determine the savings of each individual measure and the optimized bundle, and the savings to investment ratio and the other payback criteria that are associated with each energy efficiency measure. All of the guidance and the requirements around how to calculate the savings is part of that investment criteria pathway and that investment criteria appendix that matches the Washington and modeled after what's been implemented in Washington. So, kind of going back to some of the other questions or just general concerns around there is that potential for an auditor to, overinflate the savings and potentially underestimate or overinflate the cost and underestimate the savings rather, so that there's fewer or no cost-effective measures. But that's something that we're going to continue to look at through program implementation. And I think adding those requirements for what it takes to be a certified energy auditor will help to alleviate some of the concern there, where if there's potentially the professional licensure on the line, if somebody is a licensed architect or engineer and they're doing an audit, they would have some professional responsibility to ensure that everything is accurate. So it's something that we'll continue to look at through program implementation, through auditing the audits, through potential maybe disqualification of energy auditors that are out there doing audits for program compliance. So with the definitions for energy audits, there's this addition for energy audits with decarbonization assessments. So it was the general feedback from the RAC that since the goal of the BPS is carbon reduction as a state and meeting our greenhouse gas reduction goals, that including this decarbonization assessment component of an energy audit would be educational and could be part of the decision-making process for an owner to have the additional information about the emissions reduction potential for energy efficiency measures, for instance, and that it would be good to know that decarbonization potential. So that is included. We've retained that language with decarbonization assessments attached to the energy audits. And then there is also the potential for local jurisdictions to, in the future, layer on with a complementary performance standard that does look at greenhouse gas intensity. We've seen a similar situation happen in Washington where there's a statewide program based on energy use intensity, and then the city of Seattle's adopted a greenhouse gas intensity based building performance standard. So there's the potential for something similar to happen in Oregon. I know Portland's done a lot of work in evaluating this too. So we think that including this decarbonization assessment component of energy audits now as part of the statewide BPS could potentially help prepare for a different complementary local jurisdiction building performance standard that is based more on carbon emissions reduction. We received a comment about the energy management plan and that it's to ensure that a building meets its targets and how to balance those burdens on the building owner manager. There's this list in the ASHRAE standard of things that are part of the required parts of the energy management plan. While there were some of the elements that were listed in Standard 100 that seemed like they might be quite burdensome or cumbersome for an owner to include as part of their management plan, and maybe didn't seem necessarily critical for the purposes of statewide building performance standards. So we have separated out some of those measures, some of those elements as critical and required, like shall be included in the management plan, and some of those elements as recommendations and encouraged to include in the plan too. So we think that there's a good balance between the required elements and then potentially making it a little bit easier for a building owner and reducing the burden on a building owner for generating that plan. There was some questions at the time around district energy systems and the discussion of an example in a case where there's a district energy system and a central heating plant, for example, that provides steam to a number of buildings, and how to address that. So Washington's recently added this district energy appendix. So we would also look to incorporating that, and we'll discuss that after we get through this list of RAC comments today. And then similarly, we've had some discussions around campus buildings and mixed use buildings, and some of those clarifications were also built into the most recent Washington update. So we'll also look to bring those into. I think our overall plan would be to best align with Washington to the extent that we can there. We had some questions around campus buildings and EUI targets and how to determine those EUI targets based on mixed uses. So in those situations where you do have multiple buildings on a campus that are all potentially under 1 meter, and you can't necessarily separate out the individual usage of those buildings, how to determine targets. So in those cases, EUI targets can be based on the weighted averages, kind of a weighted average mix of each individual building's target. So if you've got some larger buildings that are one use, smaller buildings that are another use with a different target, the entire campus could have its weighted average energy use target that's calculated and defined for the purposes of determining overall building compliance. And then kind of on that same topic for campus buildings and submetering was the question of, would a campus building necessarily need to submeter to exclude their non-covered buildings that might be on the same general utility meter? So the answer there, and I think the discussion that we had and where we arrived at with the RAC, was that it would be most beneficial to give owners the flexibility where you do have non-covered buildings as part of a whole campus, to give owners the flexibility where if they do decide to install a private submeter on that building, to exclude that, to be able to just carve out the energy usage and the scope boundary for the covered buildings. That could be one pathway. But another pathway could be treating the entire campus as, if there are buildings without targets or uncovered buildings on there too, if you can calculate a target, calculate a weighted average target for the entire campus and comply on a weighted average basis. If you are not able to calculate a target, then it would become a situation where the owner needs to either install submeters or they can follow the investment criteria pathway. And if you follow the investment criteria pathway, things like energy audits and management plans, operations and maintenance plans would still only apply to the covered buildings that are part of that overall meter. There's a question in there about targets that are weighted. Is there a minimum square foot or percentage per use type? I don't think so, but I would actually have to go back and look. I don't recall if there is a threshold there. There was some comments around partially vacant buildings. So there are some exemptions for buildings that are vacant or don't have any occupancy yet. So if a building does meet one of those exemption criteria, they could obtain or could be approved for exemption from BPS requirements. But there's also this language in ASHRAE 100 around if there's some portions of buildings that are non-heated, non-cooled, non-illuminated, then those portions of the buildings could be subtracted out when determining building compliance if they're separately metered. This is probably not a very common scenario, and we kind of discussed this as a RAC. So I don't think this is going to come up very often where you've got where you've truly got spaces of buildings that are totally unheated, totally uncooled, totally non-illuminated, just for general building maintenance and freeze protection purposes. But so we haven't really made any adjustments to the language in ASHRAE there because we just kind of kept the language the same. And there are already allowances in the bill itself for semi-heated spaces, as long as those semi-heated spaces do align with the definition of what a semi-heated space in the building code is, and subtracting out the semi-heated space when you're determining your total floor area for the purposes of BPS compliance thresholds. We did get some comments too about audits and levels of audits. So we had some discussion as a RAC around level 1 audits versus level 2 audits. And is there the potential to allow for a level 1 or allow for a level 2? The Washington standard for the investment criteria does require level 2 audits. And we did have some conversations with Washington about this and the workability of like one audit level over another. We do understand that there's some potential. I think there's been like some recent discussions around, it's not really defined yet, but this recent discussion around like a level 1.5, level 1.5 audit. I think that the ASHRAE standard 211 is looking at like something in between, maybe a level 1, level 2, but we don't really have a reference that we can look to there for what that means yet. So I think the general feedback and preference from the RAC that we heard was that a level 1 audit is not near the level of kind of robust, comprehensive information that a building owner can take to determine an investment level, like investment grade, make an investment decision on, to calculate a real savings to investment ratio and optimized bundle of measures to follow that investment criteria pathway. So it's really just a walkthrough of a building with some general recommendations for these type of general buildings, you might be able to save on this, but it doesn't really include any specific measurement of end uses for a building. It doesn't really provide an in-depth building specific look of where the energy savings opportunities might be, and that it's not really sufficient for meeting BPS requirements. And that a level 2 audit, on the other hand, would give buildings a much more robust data and EEM alternatives that are specific to their buildings. So I think we agree that in most cases, a level 2 audit is really required to properly determine energy savings opportunities and investments. There probably is an opportunity for targeted audits that might provide a building owner with sufficient investment grade audit information. For example, if maybe a building isn't that far away from meeting their target and they want to just perform an audit on like an HVAC system, and they don't need to look at lighting, or maybe a lot of auditors have a general idea of measures that are going to pay back and maybe don't pay back. So we do recognize that there probably is some room in there for more targeted level 2 type audits. So we've added some language in there and some flexibility for audits in the future while still retaining that general requirement for like a level 2 audit. So we've given ourselves kind of the ability to revisit this in the future if there are some more definitions or needs for looking at different levels of audits in there too. So we've got this language around the energy audit with decarbonization assessment shall be a level 2 audit unless otherwise allowed by the AHJ, by ODO. So this would be something that we could continue to look at. And if there is an ability to provide some guidance and flexibility around this like level 1.5 audit, that could be something that we're open to looking at. But there's not really a good standard to look to like there is right now for level 1 versus level 2 on how to make sure that that's a comprehensive requirement. We did get a comment about the ASHRAE Standard 100 includes this default 3-year useful life of an audit. There was a comment from a RAC member that it would probably be appropriate to tie that useful life of an audit to the duration of our compliance period. So if buildings need to comply on a 5-year cycle, that it probably makes sense to extend that life of the audit to 5 years too. And that seemed reasonable. So we've made that modification from 3 to 5 years. And then similar to the discussion we've had before around what it takes to be a certified energy auditor, we received a comment from a RAC member about to encourage good faith action by building owners and auditors that ODO must reserve the right to monitor and reject audits, with a couple useful suggestions provided. So we appreciated those comments. And I think we generally agree that we do want to have some level of ability to reject an audit or to audit the audits. And this will have to be something that we look at from a resources standpoint in the future. We won't have the ability, I know, to look at every audit that comes in. But we, I think, do want to look at some meaningful sample of audits that come in to continue to make some assessment of how comprehensive and accurate they are. But we did include some language in there that gives us the ability to kind of look at audits and auditors, that we retain the ability to review and reject energy audits submitted for program compliance, and also retain the ability to monitor and evaluate energy auditors who perform energy audits for program compliance, where energy auditors demonstrate repeated failure to produce accurate and comprehensive audits. We may disqualify that auditor from performing a future audit for program compliance. So it'll be something that we have to continue to evaluate and look at over time through program implementation about, to make sure that the building owners are getting robust, comprehensive audits that are actionable toward achieving program compliance. When we were discussing the investment criteria pathway, there was a comment from a RAC member about a recommendation to allow consideration of the social cost of carbon in the calculations and investment payback and life cycle cost analysis. There wasn't a desire, what we heard, to require it to be included explicitly, but we didn't want to permanently exclude it either. So we have added some language to the investment criteria appendix that adds that as an allowable consideration when a building owner and an auditor are calculating their overall savings. So I'll show where that is. So the cost, in the section that talks about costs and savings measures, that savings calculations may include estimates for savings associated with the social cost of carbon and greenhouse gas emissions. So it does give the owner the ability and kind of the guidance, encouragement to include some savings associated with the social cost of carbon if they choose, if that's maybe part of their internal corporate policy or organizational goals, that it can be included there to help potentially provide a little bit of an additional bump for the energy savings and the savings to investment ratio. The general comments from the RAC regarding EUI targets, and we'll hear more about the specific targets in next week's public meeting after our consultant and SVW is kind of complete with their initial look at what are the average energy uses. But the goal is that we got from the RAC members that our general goal is to maximize emissions reductions, thinking of this as a principle, and encourages the group to be as ambitious as possible unless there are compelling reasons not to, and also supporting the targets as the mean, the average, and the most stringent that would be allowed under the definition that's in House Bill 3409. So as a kind of response to that, we are including, and our consultant is working under the direction and kind of feedback from the RAC that they've gotten in the past meetings, that the initial drafts for the targets will be that average EUI. So there will be the essentially the most efficient that we could set them as defined in the statute. So there was a comment around, and some discussion that we've had around utility data aggregation, and we've heard a lot from the building owners and the utilities around this, that so if there is a way to streamline utility data aggregation, that it could be helpful. Concerned, we heard some city feedback about like having a statewide policy that might require rules could be desirable and allow utilities to have some flexibility on how to get there, but it could be useful to have some overall statewide guidance. This is something that we haven't really, I don't really have a great like something to bring back to the RAC at this point yet, just because it's something that we continue to work with through our with some of our utilities who had some concern around resources and potentially data privacy issues around this. So it's something that we're going to continue to look at. And we may include some draft language that's part of the public comment period around this utility data aggregation, but we don't really have a draft of what that statewide requirement could be yet. So something we're definitely going to continue to look at, though. And then the final summary comment here is around the EUI targets and demand flexibility. In our last meeting, there was some discussion around if and how we might be able to consider flexibility in EUI target setting. And if an owner or a building has some sort of a demand response capability and ability to shave their peak in periods of high demand, that could potentially help contribute to the grid, to the local energy system, by offering some demand response flexibility, and how they might be able to get credit for that. I think in general, we agree with the importance of demand flexibility, and having a grid or an interactive building could be critical heading into the future as we look toward more loads on our grids and increased periods of higher peaks in the region and in the state. We'll continue to explore, I think, the ability to potentially incentivize or offer credits for demand response with regard to BPS compliance. I know that the concept of potentially allowing some credit or some slight increase to the EUI target if a building meets demand response criteria, that is something that I think is intriguing and interesting, although I think it's not likely to be part of this current rulemaking, since the focus of the EUI targets is really site energy use and not kilowatts, not peak demand, but kilowatt hours and BTUs. Although it is something that I think we'll continue to look at. Maybe becomes part of our incentive program. Maybe it does become part of some future credit that could be achieved. But I think just given the timeline and everything that we need to do to get the rules in place this year, it would be hard to come up with the right solution for that, just given the timeline. So I guess with that, that's kind of all the comments that I've summarized. Hopefully we did a good job to kind of consolidate and bring together all the comments, everything that we've heard over the course of our, I think, 6 or 7 meetings now with the RAC. So I guess I'll just take that time to thank the RAC for all the good feedback and the good comments and information that you all have given. So now, I guess, is there anything that we missed? Anything else to kind of chat about? Our general rules, just looking toward the next item on the agenda to discuss the most recent updates in Washington and if or how we want to incorporate those in Oregon. So, see, I don't see any hands raised now. No. Okay.
I'll just jump in and say,
oh yeah. Okay. Go for it.
Because you haven't seen the summary document before, I just appreciate how much you've been taking notes and what we've been talking about. It was a little, so I just see a lot of work on yours and Wendy's part here. So thanks very much.
Yeah, happy. Thank you for all the good comments so far. And we will. This will be something that we try to do also as we receive more public comments during the public period, is to try to summarize them and just try to make sure that everything is transparent and available. Okay. So I guess with that, I don't see any other hands raised. So I guess with that, let's look to the new Washington changes. I don't know if anybody's had really a chance, any of the RAC members have really had a chance to kind of go through these yet, but they do offer some, maybe the folks that do more work in Washington, but Washington has offered some, I think, really good training sessions with recordings, and the slides are posted up there too about what the changes are. But I think we can go through them. So I dropped both of these in the meeting folder for today in case the RAC wants to reference them. But there's this marked up, underlined, kind of where the changes are version of the Washington rules. And then there's also the newly published integrated document where Washington works with ASHRAE to publish the Washington specific version of Standard 100. So the most recent integrated version of the document, when you're looking at it, you can't necessarily tell like what changed with this version of it. You can just see what changed compared to the base ASHRAE standard. But one thing I like about this underlined version is you can actually see what is changing with the most recent updates. So the general changes that have happened are mostly around this addition for a district energy system pathway. And honestly, I have not been tracking everything that's been happening in Washington ever since like the originating legislation that required Washington's Department of Commerce to add this pathway. But I think the general reason for adding this pathway is to address these district energy systems where you've got maybe a centralized boiler plant or a centralized chiller plant that's providing energy to a bunch of different buildings on a campus, like on a university campus or a hospital campus or some other campus, where it might take longer to generate or to achieve energy efficiency savings if you've got this one like big plant, and it might be a little bit hard to totally replace that entire plant or implement an energy efficiency measure with that plant. So there's this new allowance for district energy systems to develop a decarbonization plan. And what it essentially does is it gives an additional 15 years compliance timeline for meeting. So if a district energy system develops this decarbonization plan, it bumps out their compliance timeline by 15 years, where they can submit their plan, have it approved, and then supply periodic updates for every 5 years for how they're meeting the requirements and how they're implementing their decarbonization plan. But ultimately, the entire campus, the district energy campus, would still need to comply with the building performance standard, EOI target, or investment criteria pathway. But it essentially gives them just a little bit more time to get there if they choose to go this district energy system pathway. So all that is contained in a new appendix in the Washington standard for, it's called, let's see. Let me make sure. I've got it here. Oh, wait, hold on. Oh, no, sorry. There it is. Okay. This Appendix W, where it essentially requires if a district energy campus wants to follow this pathway, that they would need to provide notification to the AHJ that they want to follow that pathway, and then it gives timelines for requirements of submitting the plan. So, if we were to incorporate this, our timelines would be a little bit different just because we're on a different overall program timeline than Washington, just a couple years later. But most of the other language in here, I think, would be very similar, where it would just push out the requirements for overall BPS compliance if an owner of a district energy system does want to pursue this pathway. So I don't know if there are any general questions about this pathway or kind of general feelings. I think Clark, you did provide some comments back to the RAC just before this meeting about this. So if you have any, yeah.
Yeah, I guess I would just say, I think aligning with Washington is going to make sense for us in the near, mid, and long term. So it makes sense for you to make these adjustments, in my opinion. And it seems consistent with the discussion we had with our RAC as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks for that. Ben?
Oh, can you remind me, for tier 1, does that include hospitals?
It does not. The hospitals are part of tier 2.
Okay, yeah, I'm just trying to think of a tier 1 district energy kind of scenario in Oregon, and nothing's coming to mind because it seems like it's all hospitals or universities.
Right. Yeah. So that is a good clarification, because in Washington, those hospitals and universities are part of tier 1. So they have a little bit more near-term need to, I think, define district energy system compliance. I'm not personally aware of any district energy systems that might need to utilize this pathway, but that's not to say that they're not out there. And that if we can incorporate a pathway at this time to address those needs if they do exist.
I think there is one at the brewery blocks in the Pearl in Portland, and there may also be one in South Waterfront, but I'm not certain.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it'll have more relevance in coming years as other district systems potentially come online.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thanks for that, Clark. That's right. I think there's a district cooling system in the Pearl. They're calling that.
Okay. Thanks.
Yeah, so there is probably a need to define it now for tier 1 buildings. There are scenarios where you have a single meter serving multiple buildings, but I wouldn't necessarily, like, I might call it like a campus energy system is how we would refer to it, or we call it shared systems here, but we don't define district energy separately. So that might just be something else for clarification. What's the difference between district energy or a shared kind of 2 buildings or 3 buildings on a single energy meter? Because that's a fairly common scenario. Like Adidas campus will have like a natural gas meter that serves 3 buildings and an electric meter that serves 2 buildings, including an overlapping building. So we just report them all as one. And but I don't know if this would apply or not. But if it does, then I think I just need some clarification of what do we mean by district energy versus like a completely owned, going back to that site definition. Like district energy suggests to me that this is more than one site versus like one property owner for multiple buildings.
Yeah, and that is a really good clarification, because a district energy system is different than just a campus or a group of buildings all in one meter. A district energy system is where you have like a central boiler plant or a central chiller plant that's providing energy to multiple buildings that are like all connected through some piping network or or other means to achieve that. Where you've got a campus building is a situation where you've got multiple meetings or multiple buildings on one, just for example, like on one energy meter, and those are separate. So like campus buildings that aren't a district energy system wouldn't have this district energy pathway, because there is no like central plant that could be decarbonized. They're just receiving energy from the grid or from the utility. And those campuses would still need to comply with either the energy use intensity target requirements or investment criteria, with like the weighted average application for energy targets, and with the ability to sub-meter out potentially different usages. So, but that is, I think, an important clarification and distinction that we will make sure that like the definitions of campuses versus district energy systems are clear in the rules too. So especially if we adopt or not adopt, but if we just reference and use as a model the Washington language, just because I think they have some definitions of like what this district energy system campus means. We would want to make sure that ours are aligning, but also clarifying where we need to.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. So that was really I think the biggest change and the biggest addition to Washington's most recent version. But one other change that I did want to point out was related to what it means to be a qualified energy auditor. Let's see, let's find that definition. There it is. So Washington has added a couple additional certifications for what it takes to be a qualified energy auditor. So the previous version of the Washington standard in our initial drafts that we reviewed as a RAC included really these items 1, 2, and 3 as eligible certifications: licensed architect or engineer, the building assessment professional, or the certified energy auditor. The most recent version of the Washington standard also allows for 2 additional certifications: either a certified energy manager in current standing or an energy management professional. And Washington and both Oregon in our drafts always had the ability to prescribe additional certifications that meet the minimum qualifications, and we could provide notice of that like on our website or somewhere similar. So I think what Washington's done is just evaluated other certifications and then rolled those in just as part of their general rule update. And there is this requirement, going back to one of the comments in the chat earlier, that the person that is a qualified energy auditor needs to have those 3 years of professional experience in building energy auditing as well, in order to be a qualified person under this, a qualified energy auditor rather. And most of these certifications also come with some requirement for both professional experience and education. So there is kind of built into a lot of these certifications that somebody's been working in the field for a few years already. So, I think expanding the list of eligible certifications perhaps provides an increased ability, an increased pool of energy auditors to meet this potential demand and need for energy audits. And one thing that we're continually kind of looking at and hoping to address some concerns is that there won't be enough energy auditors to go out and do the work that's required as part of this process. We're hoping, we don't know yet, but fingers crossed that we'll have some additional federal funding to support that. We've applied for some certified energy auditor training dollars, but we don't know yet if we're going to receive those. But I think including a couple additional certifications would align with Washington. It would also help expand the pool a little bit to provide more potential auditors to meet the need. So curious if any RAC members have any comments there.
I have a question, I guess. So the 3 years experience, how would you reconcile that with like the training? So the assumption that
Yeah, I think the approach that Washington's taken that would be similar to us is that would kind of be a requirement for the building owner when they're hiring an auditor to confirm that they've got experience. Like we don't have plans to create like a qualified list of auditors, like through an RFQ process. So that would just be a general requirement that it would kind of be on like the auditor and the building owner that's hiring the auditor to confirm that that person has the required experience.
Oh, I guess I was asking if you're going to be doing trainings to get people to become auditors.
Yeah.
If they need 3 years experience, if you train them, then how they go out and support the work before they get their experience. I guess, how would that work?
Okay, so yeah, I don't think that we'll be doing any training ourselves to train an auditor, but what we hope to do is be able to offer some funding for an auditor to go and take some of these courses and the trainings associated with it. But it would, I think, just be 3 years of like working in the energy auditing space, maybe with a certified energy auditor or with a qualified energy auditor to have that experience in there too. But it won't be something that we're like providing energy auditing training on. We would look to the market and these certifications to provide that.
Gotcha. Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Let's see. Is there anything in the chat there too? I do see a comment there from Kara. Thanks for reaching out and being interested in helping solve the utility data aggregation issue. So yeah, definitely willing to take you up on that. So maybe I'll reach out after the meeting there. And I think we've got some additional discussions planned and hoping to potentially have something on that for the public review period. I do see a comment in there from Michael about state buildings with a question mark. So in Oregon, I think state buildings won't have any separate requirements. They'll just be part of, if they're over the threshold for BPS compliance, they would have to meet the requirements, same as any other building as well. So. Let's see. Are there any other hands raised or comments? I'm not seeing any right now. So. All right, well, I think kind of with that there, it seems like the general feedback is for Odo for us to, look at the most recent Washington changes too, and then build those into our draft rules since we have the opportunity now to pick those up and build them in. And we'll certainly continue our coordination with the folks up in Washington just as we do that, to make sure that we're aligned, and if there are any comments that they have as we look to potentially pick those up, we'll definitely look to incorporate those. Let's see, and with that kind of brings us to the last item on our agenda, which is really just looking at like a wrap up and next steps. So I'm gonna, I think, just stop sharing my screen so I can see everybody a little bit better, if they're there. So really the next step, so we have a general public meeting next week. The primary purpose of that meeting is for a presentation of our draft energy targets that are based on the average energy use. So there'll be a presentation and discussion of the methodology and the targets themselves from our consultants, SBW. And then after that, we'll be working internally to incorporate any comments that we do receive kind of between now and the end of the month to put together our draft rules for publishing and filing with the Secretary of State. They'll be open during the month of October and early November, and then we'll have a public comment hearing in early mid-November. And then we'll take all the comments that we got back during that public comment period and revise our rules, incorporate them as appropriate before filing them by the end of the year. So this is our final scheduled RAC meeting, but I'm certainly open if the RAC does want to have some kind of like a check-in, either during the public comment period, after the public hearing. Curious on if folks have a preference there, or if there's a need. Happy to do that too and get something on the calendar. Yeah, Clark.
Yeah, I'm just thinking that because when you get the public comments, that really will be the first time that all of the targets have been put out in public as well, right? It seems like it would make
Yes,
sense
yeah.
for us to get back together after you've done that public meeting. Those targets are out. It seems I would have expected the RAC to have gotten to weigh in kind of post-public comment on those targets, would have been my assumption.
Would you prefer a meeting sometime toward the end of the month then, or like after, or maybe a week after the so the public meeting is next Wednesday, the 11th.
Yeah.
I'm just looking at calendars, sometime the week of the 16th or the 23rd. Is that?
What do other folks think? I mean, that kind of makes sense to me. I just can imagine there might be some stuff to talk about. And at that point, you would have also solidified some of the things we talked about today, and the Washington adjustments would also be incorporated in your remarks. Is that correct?
Yeah, that'll be by the end of the month. And I don't
Okay.
know if I'm looking at like the week of the 16th, that could be, I don't know, will everything kind of pulled in by that time. But
Okay. Well, I'm open to other people's thoughts, but I'd be open for another meeting if others would.
there's also the opportunity to just have that sometime during October, because there's still the opportunity for input and revisions then too, while everything's open for public comment, if we don't need to move everything so quickly in September. Alex?
Yeah, I was wondering if the timing would be better after public comment period, if there's time to meet and just review the public comments again. And whether there's recommendations, that the RAC might make based on those. But maybe the timeline gets too tight then.
You're thinking like after the November public?
Yeah.
Yeah. That's an option too. Yeah. Open to, looks like Kevin has a hand raised also.
Yeah, thanks, Blake. I think October sounds like a, maybe not optimum, but a reasonable alternative for another RAC meeting. I know you have to be done by the end of the year, so
Yeah.
November seems logical, but it seems kind of late in the calendar. But if we could get maybe some interim comments and review those targets, I think that October date that you're suggesting might work.
Okay. I think that sounds reasonable, and it maybe gives us a little more time too, because we'll be working, I think, pretty hard to get everything in by the end of September. So I think we'll look at that. We'll look at some dates in October, maybe the middle of October for a RAC meeting, and then we can discuss the targets themselves if there are any particular RAC feedback on that. It'll kind of be a focused opportunity for the RAC to provide comments. And then if we have gotten any public comments in that time too, we can certainly bring those up. And then we can also evaluate the need or desire at that time for maybe, as Alex suggested, having something else in November. All right, does that sound kind of like a plan, I guess? Okay, I'm seeing some thumbs up and head nods, so. All right.
Like it.
Great, thanks. Okay, well, I guess with that, I'm open to if there's any other comments or, Kara.
Yeah, just one question about sort of the alignment or lack thereof between tier 1 and tier 2. So understanding that tier 2, that, advisory committee won't promulgate rules in any way that will result in a plan that goes to the legislature. Do you have a sense, though, about how much those tier 2 buildings will be subject to the rules that we create here in tier 1? I mean, do you anticipate that they'd be similar? Should we be sort of thinking about how tier 2 buildings might or might not fit? Anyway,
Okay.
just flagging that.
So you're thinking like down the line when we do
Yeah.
make a recommendation. Yeah, I mean, I think
It'd be nice for some of the core definitions, et cetera, to, flow through and expectations, but maybe it's different enough that it really doesn't matter, but just flagging that was a thought I had.
Yeah. I think that is a good thought and good something to be kind of thinking about. I think it's probably like a reasonable baseline expectation that like any future potential recommended building performance standard for tier 2 buildings would be somewhat similar to the building performance standard for tier 1 buildings. But that's all still kind of at the recommendation and
Okay.
evaluation of that committee, and
Got it.
And that would still take, I think, additional legislation at the time too, because all that we're going to be doing then is providing a recommendation for a potential standard. So it would then still be on the legislature to make a decision about our recommendation.
Okay,
So-
then sort of two related questions, again, thinking about the interaction between tier 1 and tier 2 buildings. I'm thinking about the funding that you have, the state funding and the CPRG funding, wondering if you've contemplated where those dollars might go. Do you think you'll pull aside some so that in the event there are tier 2 buildings that do want early incentives, for example,
Mhm.
that they have access to that money? Or are you thinking there'll be more money down the line? And then I think also wondering about how possible it might be to speed up that tier 2 plan, because I think there are buildings, you're going to save those buildings money, right? The sooner you get that plan in front of the legislature, the better. I think that folks I've talked to are really anxious to have regulations in place, knowing that they're going to come and wanting to do things sooner rather than later. I know it's a bit off topic for tier 1, but there is a lot of interaction between those.
So as far as the timeline goes, with the recommendation for a BPS for tier 2 buildings, that it directs us to provide it by 2030. But as far as like, I suppose we could provide it sooner, but I think some of the recommendation will be based on the data that we collect from the initial benchmarking round of tier 2 buildings in 2028. So I don't know how much opportunity there is to speed it up, but if there is, I think we're open to discussing that. Yeah.
And then the dollars.
Oh yeah. Thanks. Sorry. The incentive. Yes, I think with our CPRG funding and then the other bucket of $2 million state funding that we received. We would look to make that available for either early compliance for tier 1 buildings or voluntary compliance for tier 2 buildings that do choose to comply. Yeah.
Okay, that's great. And then I guess a follow on, wondering if a section of those dollars might be used to fix some of the utility complaints you're hearing. In particular, I'm thinking about consumer-owned utilities, not the investor-owned utilities, to assist them in complying with that data aggregation barrier.
I think initially we envisioned that funding would go to provide incentives for building owners to implement energy efficiency measures for early and voluntary compliance. I don't know that we've really contemplated using that funding to help overcome some of the barriers, but as we get into developing the incentive programs and how to use that funding, I think we're open to it. Yeah, I think it's a good suggestion, but it's not something that we've thought about too much yet.
If I can
Yeah.
tag on
Yeah.
that.
Mhm. Yeah, go ahead,
Because
Mark.
if you start to look at the amount of money you can provide and the number of buildings that might need help, I guess it seems to me that if we can actually get the utilities to help do some of the aggregation, you might get more bang for your buck from the money spent.
Mhm.
Because doing it building by building, you're going to run out of money overnight. And we've seen some other ODO incentives do that. Whereas if we can help the utilities actually do this aggregation to help the building owners get through it, you might be able to touch more customers.
Yeah, I think it's a good idea. Thanks for that. Because yeah, we have the $2 million of funding that was appropriated from the state, and then we have the additional bucket of I think about $10 million from the CPRG for additional incentives, but that can go pretty quickly for projects. And yeah, maybe there's an opportunity to use some of that funding for other valuable, cost-effective purposes too. There is a question from Brad about the next week's forum is tightly focused on the benchmarking and target development. It will have a portion of next week's meeting as well that looks at the RAC activity. So most of next week's public meeting will be discussion of the targets, but we will have a portion of that meeting also that summarizes the RAC activity since the last public meeting. Thanks for that, Brad. Vin. Yeah, question.
Oh, hey, I'm curious about kind of to what Kara was speaking to earlier and in the chat about the utility data aggregation. I know that there's, you all had kind of solicited feedback from the RAC on whether or not additional rules would be needed. Would those rules flow through this process that's currently played through the end of the year, or would that be a separate process?
So that's one of the things that we're considering. It could be part of these rules. We are not required to make them part of these rules, similar to like our other requirements to finish rules by the end of the year for the BPS. It's something that we may do. So it could be something that we include with this round of rules, but if there's not like a general consensus, or if we don't come up with a good solution, then it could be something that we just look at as part of future rules next year too. So.
Yeah, that might be another topic to discuss it if we have one more RAC meeting to kind of see how that conversation's advancing at ODO.
Okay. All right. Yeah, we can make a note to talk about that. Yeah, see a thumbs up from Clark there too. Let's see. I'm not seeing any other hands raised or comments in the chat. So I'll happy to hang on for a few more minutes if anybody wants to chat about anything, but otherwise, don't want to keep anybody here longer than they need to be. So, in general, thanks a lot for all the participation so far, and look forward to continuing to work with the rest of the RAC through the end of the year as we look to finalize our rules. So thanks, everybody. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right.
Thanks.
Yep. Thanks. All right. Thanks, Abby. Thanks, Wendy.
Thanks, Blake. I'll send you my notes shortly.
Sounds good.